All right, I'm in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, normally referred to as the passage about the woman who was caught in adultery. It really isn't about adultery, it's about some other things, and that's what I'm going to be talking about this morning, is what this was really about. But in order to get into this, let's review a little bit from chapter 7, just a little, in order to understand the context of what's happening. What happened the night before was that this was the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, and there was a discussion that took place in the Sanhedrin, where they were meeting. There was a discussion that was taking place, and it's starting to get a little out of hand. All right? This is described in John chapter 7, beginning in verse 45. In verse 45, it says, "Then the officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, 'Why have you not brought him?'" referring to Jesus. The officers answered, "No man ever spoke like this man," which was a way of saying, "Yes, you sent us to go and arrest him, but when we went to go and arrest him, we were hearing him speak, and he was speaking in a way that we can't find any reason to arrest him. So you're going to have to give us a little bit more to go on as to why we should arrest him, seize him by force, and bring him over here in front of you." All right, in verse 46, the officers answered, "No man ever spoke like this man." Then the Pharisees answered them, "Are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed." All right, so the religious leaders were asserting that they were the ones who are the ones who decide what you believe. All right, as the leaders, they say that they are the ones who decide what you think is true and what you don't think is true. That's what they do. That's their role in your life, which should never be. All right, that should never be the case in any relationship that may exist between people who are being ruled with those who are ruling them, or any kind of relationship. There should not be a person who makes the decisions about what somebody believes or what somebody else doesn't believe. But that was what they thought, right? And it turns out today there are still a lot of people who are in positions of authority who relate to others in that way, all right? But continuing on, "Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed," which is understandable when you consider the law. The law states that either you obey the law or you are cursed by God. That's what God said. You either obey all the commandments and be blessed, or you will violate the commandments and you will be cursed by God. That's what they're referring to. So if a person does not know the law, well, then they are by default going to be cursed by God. They're not going to be able to claim, "Well, I didn't know." That's not going to work. All right. This is why it's important for people to know the law under these kinds of conditions and circumstances, because you're going to be responsible for living in obedience to the law. So when they say that the people are accursed because they don't know the law, then what they are effectively saying is that this is just the default, and that it is the role of the religious leaders to inform the people of what the law is, and so they are not going to be accursed. Well, it just so happens that by stating this, that these people don't know the law, they are, in effect, they are confessing that they have failed. Right? They have failed the people. They have failed. These leaders have failed the people. They have not informed them in such a way that the people understand the law. Therefore, they are confessing, in a sense, that they themselves are responsible for the people being accursed. And so this is a way of understanding that the situation is starting to get a little bit out of hand, that the religious leaders are saying things themselves that will condemn themselves. They They are bearing witness to the fact that they themselves are not legitimate leaders. All right, and this is just a beginning of that. Going on into verse 50, Nicodemus says, who came to Jesus by night, being one of them, said to them, does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he is doing? Okay, he just simply asks the question. Do we judge someone before we hear them, before we have a proper trial in a sense? And that is correct. The leaders are not to be passing judgment on Jesus or on any of the people until there is a discussion, until there is an opportunity for people to defend themselves. You can't legitimately just pass judgment on someone without things being done in a certain order. And the law of Moses has provisions for this. There are laws that are to be followed concerning this. And Nicodemus asked the question, shouldn't we be following the laws related to passing judgment on someone else? He asks the question, and the answer is that they are obviously violating the law, violating the Mosaic law, just by making this declaration in verse 48. But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed. Well, there are procedures related to this that they are not following. In verse 52, they answered and said to him, are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee. And in the previous message, I explained that, well, it just so happens that there were several prophets who came out of the region of Galilee. So they are, this is what I mean by it's getting out of hand. It's getting out of hand in the sense that out of their frustration, out of their concern, out of their fears, they are exposing the truth that they themselves are not living in obedience to the Mosaic law, and therefore they themselves are under the curse of God themselves. So what happens in verse 53, and everyone went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. That's chapter 8, verse 1. So everybody just went home. Just go home, which is probably the best thing to do in this kind of a situation. Just walk away. Don't continue to make matters worse, which is what they were doing. So they've had an opportunity to sleep on this. Okay, they've had a chance to go home, get some rest, unwind, decompress a little bit from the events of the day. There was a lot that happened, and so they're going to come back the next morning. They're going to be there, and Jesus is coming back too. So this is the situation. Now they've already had plenty of confrontations with Jesus. There has been a lot of opportunities for Jesus to have a discussion with them, for them to have a discussion with him, for there to be an expression of conflict. Earlier in chapter 7, beginning in verse 19, Jesus says to the people, did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. So why do you seek to kill me? Right? Because they themselves don't keep the law. And in addition to that, for what reason would they have to kill him? Verse 20, the people answered and said, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? You're demonically possessed. We're not seeking to kill you. And I explained this in the previous messages. Verse 21, Jesus answered and said to them, I did one work and you all marvel. Moses, and then he gives them an example of how they don't live in obedience to the law. Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So he was explaining to them that because they circumcise someone on the Sabbath, they are performing a procedure that is considered to be work. This is a procedure that could wait until the following day. The young boy at 8 days of age, his life is not in danger. And so through their own personal laws that they have added to the law of Moses to try to make sure that people don't violate the law of Moses, they could wait. So they're violating their own law in that respect. And there is a challenge by Jesus stating that if we are to use that definition of observing the Sabbath law, if we use that definition, then you guys are violating the Sabbath law by what you do. This was an open-ended issue, all right? And so they are in the religious leaders are in a circumstance where they are going to be put on the defensive, all right? That's effectively what's happening, is that the leaders are in effect being put on the defensive. And their response is, well, we've got to find some way to show that Jesus needs to be on the defensive, that's how they're going to solve this. Instead of resolving their own failures, instead of solving their own problems, they're going to attack Jesus and say that he's got problems that need to be resolved. That way, everybody's attention is supposedly on Jesus and his problems, and so they don't have to deal with themselves and their problems. This is a way that some people solve the personal problems that they have in life. It really is no solution, all right? But there is the appearance that there is a solution, and it's a way that people can feel good about themselves through a lie, all right? Through being dishonest and through living a lie and through not living in reality. But nobody's questioning them anymore because everybody's now thinking about something else. All right, at least until they get done thinking about that, I suppose, and then they'll go back to thinking about how dysfunctional you are. And all right, well, they don't care. It appears to be that they don't care. And why would they? Who's going to have greater authority over them in order to confront them and demand some sense of accountability? There really isn't anyone. That's the issue. Okay, so this is the circumstance. These are the conditions. So Jesus comes back the next morning. What are they going to do now, right? Well, we already have a lot of history in the previous couple of years with Jesus' ministry. We have a lot of history and a lot of examples where they have confronted Jesus and they have tried to condemn him through supposed failings, through him perhaps engaging in sin. All of these circumstances have failed up to date, so now they're going to approach him differently. That's what's happening here in chapter 8. They're going to approach Jesus differently. And the way that they approach him is by trying to show that he is violating the Mosaic law. All right, this is what they're going to try to do. Now, before, all of the issues and arguments were around their additional laws, what we would refer to today as the Talmud, the Talmudic laws. They were arguing over the additional laws that they established so that you would never violate the law of Moses. Okay, what they're going to do now is address Jesus, speak to him, confront him with something specific in the law of Moses. And they pick the topic of adultery. It really isn't about adultery. It's about whether or not they can show that Jesus is going to violate the Mosaic law. All right, that's what's happening. So beginning in chapter 8, verse 2, now early in the morning, he came again into the temple, referring to Jesus, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say?" All right? And that's the question. what do you say? Moses said this, but what do you say? All right. Now, if he agrees with Moses, if he says yes, then there will be consequences, and I'll explain that in just a minute. If he says no, well, then there's an obvious consequence. Moses says this, you say something different, we got you. We got you. You are violating the Mosaic law. You are teaching the people contrary to the Mosaic law. We got you. You've been telling us that we are not living in obedience to the Mosaic law, so now we got you. We got you in a circumstance where you are violating the Mosaic law. If he says no. Now, if he says yes, well, then he's going to be violating the Mosaic law also, because Moses had a lot more to say than just this situation of if a woman is caught in adultery, or anybody's caught in adultery, then they are to be put to death. You see, adultery was not, the consequence for adultery was not divorce. The consequence for adultery was execution, right? Nobody got divorced over adultery. People got divorced. People were executed over adultery. Okay, that was what the law was about. That was the Mosaic law. Now, in verse, let's go back here into verse. Lost my place. Verse 4. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act." So in verse 4, we have a situation, and there's no question about this. Apparently, this has taken place, and this would mean that they would have witnesses who actually witnessed the act taking place. All right, these witnesses interrupted what was happening, and are available in order to testify that this has happened. So there's no question about this whatsoever. But when they say in verse 5, now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, when they say that, then they're raising the issue of should we perform the execution or should we not perform the execution? If Jesus says no, then he's in violation of the law. If he says yes, then he'll be in violation of some other laws, and I'll explain that in just a minute. Let me go ahead and proceed. I'll come back to this. All right. Proceed into verse 6. This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. He simply did not answer the question. He did not respond. He just went down to the ground and started drawing on the ground a little bit with his finger. In verse 7, so they continued asking him. He raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. All right? So he solved the problem by just simply making an announcement. Well, whoever is without sin among you, then let him throw the first stone. Now, you got to understand the law in order to understand this conversation. Otherwise, it can be easy to come up with some conclusions that are not necessarily valid conclusions and are not necessarily intended to be stated here. All right. For example, people can say things like, well, if you're going to pass judgment against someone else, then you should be prepared to throw the first stone, and we should also make sure that you don't have any sin yourself. All right? And that's where people will usually go with this, is that they will come to these conclusions, and these become the formal messages and sermons that get presented from this section in John chapter 8. All right? So, if you don't have any sin, then sure, you can throw a stone at somebody who's committed sin. But if you have sin, well, then you don't really qualify. Well, in the law, it doesn't require that. All right, you don't have to be a sinless person in order to be a witness in a trial. You don't have to be a sinless person in order to be a person who participates in an execution. The law does not require that. You don't have to be a sinless person to be a judge, to pass judgment on a situation, on a circumstance, if you're called upon to do so. The law doesn't require these things. But because of this passage and the way that a lot of people interpret it and use it, because of that, it turns out that a lot of people, they just take this position that we have to have that sinless person. We've got to have a pastor, we've got to have a priest, we've got to have somebody who's totally sinless, and so that we've got someone who can qualify to address these kinds of issues in other people's lives. That's what happens, a lot. And if a person has committed sin in some way, well, then they're disqualified, and we need to remove them from our lives because they're no good, they're not useful. We've got to find one of those sinless people, and that's just simply not reality. Okay, you're never going to find that whatsoever. And so people will use that, where they will say, "Do not judge unless you are sinless," and that just simply is not part of the law. Going on, we'll see what Jesus said to the woman, where he said, "Go and sin no more." I'll come back to that in a little bit, but that's the second approach that people often take. Okay, now, if we go back and take a look at the situation, I think we can have a better understanding with regards to what the trap really was. If Jesus said no, you should not stone her, then he would obviously be violating Moses. They asked, well, Moses said this. What do you say? If you disagree with Moses, then, hey, we got you, right? So don't disagree with Moses. But now if he says yes, then there is another problem. And that's because this is not all that Moses had to say. All right? And I want you to pay attention to this. You need to understand the Mosaic law well when it comes to discussions about what is good and what is evil, about adultery, about divorce, about whatever it may be. Okay? You need to remember what I'm telling you when I say this. I want you to remember this, that you need to know all that was conveyed through Moses. You need to know all the law in order to have, in general, a better perspective on the situations at hand and to be able to respond well to these kinds of questions of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, what is a violation of the law, and what is not. It's not what Moses said. It's all that Moses said. All right? And when it comes to this topic, there's more that he had to say. There's a lot more. All right? So we know we have no question as to whether or not adultery has taken place, but there are some other things that need to be included in this discussion. There's some other laws that need to be added to the discussion in order to involve all that Moses had to say. I'm going to start with Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. If I can find that. Here we go. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress, shall surely be put to death. All right, that's Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. So, where is he? He's not here. Okay, and so in the law, if you're going to put someone to death, in this case the adulteress, you need to put the adulterer to death also. Where is he? He's not here. They just brought the woman. And so if a judgment takes place, and there is also a subsequent execution that takes place, All right, well, we have a problem because only the adulteress is being executed, not the adulterer. And this might seem like it's a small issue, but it's not. It's a big issue. And it's part of all that Moses had to say. You would be executing one and not executing the other. This is a form of perversion of justice. All right? This is not fulfilling all of the law. This is only fulfilling part of the law, but it's not all of the law. Okay? Now what this means is that you've got the woman, the adulteress, who clearly has not exited the relationship with whoever she's married to. All right? That this relationship is not ended. And so, this would be by definition an act of adultery. And you could make an argument for the man as well, that perhaps he, the same thing. So we have enough information to know that this has happened, but in order to fulfill the law, we have to have the man present, and he has to be a part of this also. And he's not there. So if judgment takes place, then we would have a perversion of justice where the man is allowed to live, but the woman is not. That's a perversion of justice. So for this, I would direct you to Exodus chapter 23. Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 and 2, where it says in Exodus chapter 23, you shall not circulate a false report. We don't really have that happening at the moment. Keep reading. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. All right? Now, this may sound a little subtle, but this is what's going on. They are perverting justice. There is a following after a crowd to do evil. And what the evil is that we're going to execute one person but not the other. That is a perversion of justice. You shall not, in verse 3, chapter 23, verse 3, you shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. That, is part of this, not part of this situation, it's part of the verse, but it's part of the issue that we are showing partiality to one and we are excluding someone else. It's a perversion of justice that's taking place, and to follow the crowd, all right, to follow the crowd, you've got a majority of people who are into this. A majority of the people are wanting to do this, and it's a social pressure, all right, a social pressure to participate and cooperate, or you might be seen as someone who's not really that supportive of Moses. Okay? So that's part of the law. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. All right? And nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. And there is a perversion of justice that is taking place by not including the adulterer in this trial and not including him as part of the execution. So if Jesus says yes, all right, if he says yes, then he is violating Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 and 2, and he is violating Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. That's what he would be doing. If he says no, he's obviously saying something different than Moses. If he says yes, then he's going to violate Moses. This is the trap. All right? This is the trap. That's why it says that they said this in verse 6, John chapter 8, verse 6. They said this, testing him that they might have something of which to accuse him. And they would. They would be able to accuse him of Exodus 23 or Leviticus chapter 20. So folks, if you're going to be involved in discussions related to what is right and wrong and good and evil, you better know all that Moses had to say, or things could things may not work out in the way that you think, or the way that you would expect, or the way that you would want to. This is why Jesus decided to not participate. That's what he did. He decided to just simply not participate. He just simply, stooped down to the ground and started drawing on the ground with his finger. They insisted and demanded that he give them a response. Only then did he stand up and he gave them the response, and then he went back down to drawing on the ground. All right? And his response was, whoever is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone, which is consistent with the law. Again, in the law, we have Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17, beginning in verse 2. If there is found among you within any of your gates which the Lord your God gives you, a man or woman who has been wicked in the sight of the Lord your God in transgressing his covenant. All right, and he goes on. You can advance to verse 6. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. So you shall put away the evil from among you. All right, so the witnesses themselves need to be the ones who throw the first stone by law, okay, by Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 7. So when Jesus says, let he who is among you, who is without sin, let that person cast the first stone, he's not violating Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 7. He's not violating that by stating that. What he's effectively stating is that the witnesses, because of what they are participating in, they are the ones who should cast the first stone, but they are being a witness at a trial where only the adulteress is present and not the adulterer. They should know better. They should know that they should not be giving their testimony without both people being present, without both people being involved. They're only giving partial witness. So they are committing sin by violating the law by being a witness at the trial. All right? And that is inherent in what Jesus states, he who is without sin. Okay? But included with this is him indirectly telling them that they are the ones who are violating Leviticus chapter 20 and Exodus chapter 23. They are the ones who are violating Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, and 23, verse 1 and 2. They're the ones who are doing this. They are trying to trap him into violating those laws. But all he has to do is do nothing. All right? And so that's what he does. He does nothing. And presents to them the fact that by their presenting this to him, they are going to be violating the very laws that they are trying to entrap him with. They are violating the same laws that they are trying to entrap him with. So all he has to do is nothing, just, right on the ground, okay, whatever, in order to not participate, and then they are left by themselves as the ones who are violating the law. Okay, I'll come back to this in just a minute to show you what they do. What are they going to do now? All right, well, they walk away, but they walk away in a special way, all right? Before I get to that, let's look at what he was writing on the ground. And I mean that in the sense that people keep reading this and studying this as if the more we talk about the fact that he wrote on the ground with his finger, the more that we analyze these words, the more that we debate this issue, that somehow what he wrote on the ground will miraculously just manifest and appear right out of the page that we're studying. But folks, this discussion has been happening for a long time, and still, as far as we know, what he wrote on the ground is still unknown. All right, we just don't know. There's been a lot of speculation about it. But the way that this was written, from what I understand in the Greek, the emphasis was not to be placed on what he was writing. The emphasis was to be placed on his finger. All right, that's where the emphasis is placed, which is properly placed, because this is the guy who wrote the law with his own finger. When God wrote the law on the tablets of stone, he wrote this in stone, with the finger of God. This was written, do not commit adultery. This is the person, this is God manifested in the flesh, who has taken upon himself the identity of Jesus of Nazareth. This is who he is. He's hanging out with everybody. All right, he's there to relate to everybody on a more personal level. And he's the one who wrote the law on stone with his finger. And you're questioning him about the law and what people should do about it. Okay, that is what is directly presented through the reference of him writing on the ground with his finger. It's not about what he wrote. It's about the fact that, this is the person who actually gave the law. And you're asking him, you're saying, well, this is what Moses said, which was what God said. So what are you going to say? Well, he should say the same thing that he always said. He's the one who said it. He's the one who gave the law. All right. And that's what's to be understood by the issue related to his finger. In verse 6, this they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. All right. All he has to do is nothing, and then he can accuse them of the very thing that they were trying to accuse him of. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And I just explained to you that according to all that Moses had to say, they were committing sin by bringing this case to him, by bringing this case to the temple, for this to be judged, for this to be handled, for this to be managed, for this whole crowd to be gathered together to deal with this issue. They don't have both people present. That's a violation of the law. And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground, which is just simply to emphasize the point that this is the guy, who came up with the law with his finger. And you're questioning him about this? Verse 9, then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience. What's the problem? What were they doing wrong? Violating Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, violating Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 and 2, perverting justice. All right, that's what they were doing. Being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. Now, that's a big deal. Why? It's a big deal because whenever there was a trial, or whenever there was a debate, or whenever there was an involved discussion about any topic whatsoever amongst a group of people, the decisions were made in order from the youngest to the oldest. The reason why that was done was so that the younger judges or the younger elders would not be influenced by the elders, by the older people. All right? That was why it was done in that order. But in this case, the oldest, all right, from the oldest to the youngest, the older people walk away before the younger people do. So the elders present their judgment or their decision before the younger folks do. This was the exact reverse. It was the exact opposite of what was expected during a circumstance like this. That is just profound. It's profound enough that John would write it down, and this is why he would write it down. My goodness, the elders, they walk away first. They don't even touch this one anymore. They don't want to be a part of it first. They're going to influence the younger ones. It would be good for the younger ones to be influenced. If they make bad decisions concerning this, it's all going to go wrong, all right? It's all going to go bad. So that's what's so significant about the order in which they left, with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. So it's just Jesus and the woman. There they are. All right? Now you gotta try to picture this. Here you've got this woman who has clearly violated the Mosaic law. There's no question about it. All right? This has happened. We know what the penalty should be. Is not going to work out because, well, the circumstances don't allow for that. If we're going to follow all that Moses said, we can't do that, okay? We can't issue that kind of a judgment or invoke any consequences related to this. And Jesus is there by himself with a lady. There they are in the middle of the temple. What's the lady going to do? What can she do? What should she do? She is there in the presence of this man who just saved her life. That's what he did. Because the people could have just been stirred up in a big mob and threw a bunch of rocks at her and killed her. And because this was a mob killing, we can't necessarily identify exactly who should be punished or who started it or whatever. There'd be all kinds of confusion related to this. And so it's a way of understanding that Jesus just saved her life. What can she do? What can she say? What should she say? So after waiting for a while, he said to her, right? In verse 10, when Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." She refers to him as Lord. This is a way of recognizing that she is seeing him as someone different. She is seeing him as the Messiah. She is now believing in Jesus. All right? And you can tell that she is probably just so stunned, okay, and so uncertain and so confused and doesn't know what to do. Because here you've got the man, the guy. This is God manifested in the flesh. And you have committed adultery, and everybody knows it, and he knows it. And there you are with him by yourself. What's he going to say? What's he going to say? What's he going to do? He saves your life. That's what he does. He saved her life, in a sense. And she just doesn't know what to do with that. How do you relate to a God who responds in this way? The one who wrote the law, who gave the judgment, who said what we are to do, who said she should be put to death. What do you do with, how does the woman relate to him now? She didn't know what to do. So he initiated, and he asked the question, "Is there anyone here to accuse you?" He says, "Well, then I'm not going to accuse you either. We're not going to have a discussion about this because there is a law in place. There are laws related to this and how this should be handled, and we're going to handle it the way that God said we are to handle it." And that's just the way it is. And you might think, well, then she gets away with it. You can say, well, okay, so she gets away with it. But you know what? There's something greater that has happened here than her getting away with it. And that is that she believes in Jesus, that she gets to know Jesus. Now, this is not an excuse, all right? This is just simply something that we should acknowledge, that we should recognize, that this is a good thing. All right, the rest of it's bad, obviously. This is a good thing. This being a good thing doesn't justify the bad. It just is a way of acknowledging that this is something that is good. And there is a new relationship that can be defined between her and Jesus. So what does he say? He says, go and don't do this anymore. All right? Don't do this anymore. Now, there really isn't anything more he can say than that. That's all you can really say. Just don't do this anymore. Go and sin no more. Now, when it comes to sin, people are going to continue to sin. That's just the nature of the flesh and the nature of the struggle that we have. For there to be a way to overcome sin in the way through the new covenant has to go into effect. All right? And the new covenant is not yet in effect. And so there's really not much more he can say at this time. But when the new covenant comes into effect, then there is more that can be added to this topic. There is more that can be said. There's more that can be addressed that can be of value to this woman, to others, in order to change the condition of their hearts so that they don't engage in these kinds of things. But there really isn't much more that he can do at this time because the old covenant is still in effect. Okay, so in a sense, Jesus did save her life. She believes in him. We do not know what happened to her after this. We don't know about how she may have grown or matured in the faith. We have nothing to go on when it comes to that, but this is something that we can learn a lot from in terms of this conversation. Okay, so for those of you who are using this in small groups, I've got a question for you that you could have to facilitate some discussion. How could you respond to the defense of, he who is without sin may cast the first stone? All right, how could you respond to the defense when somebody uses this to defend themselves? All right, what happens is that there is an exposure of sin. Somebody's exposed, all right, and is recognized that there are some issues that they are dealing with. How do you address this topic? It may come up. It may come up a conversation, in which case this person is going to feel exposed, all right? And when they are, how might they respond? A common response is to say, well, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. So if you don't have any sin, then we can keep talking about this. But since you have sin too, we shouldn't be talking about this anymore. All right? When that defense is presented to you, how could you respond? How could you respond? In what ways would you continue the conversation? In what ways could you continue the conversation? You can easily say, well, that's just simply is not what Jesus was talking about. That's not what he was doing. That has nothing to do with the issue at all. But it's not likely that that's going to be useful, all right? Because they're going to want to believe that. And they'll probably find some other Christians who do believe that, and then what are you going to do, right? Now, you need to find a better way to perhaps respond to that kind of defense, okay? So it's a discussion. All right, what are the better ways that you could respond in order to increase the conversation? The way to think about this is, what is your objective? All right, what is your objective when there is the exposure of sin? What is the objective? And I'll tell you, the objective is not to try to figure out how to stop the sin. The objective is how do we increase this person's dependency on the love of God? That's the objective. How do we increase this person's dependency on the love of God? If we just let them get away with, well, whoever is without sin, let them cast the first stone, then there is an escape. They don't need to be directed towards the love of God. Definitely don't need to be directed towards the forgiveness of God, because as far as they can tell, there is no need for forgiveness. All right? So it's a kind of an open discussion. Perhaps you have encountered conversations like this, and that would be a good place to start. All right? So I know that this is kind of an open-ended A really open-ended question. How would you respond when somebody defends in this way? When they say this, when they bring this up, how could you respond in a way that would be useful and productive? Okay, let's pray. Dear God, thank you so much for the time that we could spend to review the beginning of John chapter 8. And Lord, I do thank you for the giving of the law so that we can understand how you made use of it, and so that we can understand how you accomplished greater objectives than just condemnation, but how you were able to use it to bring about reconciliation. And I thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.